Good evening or good morning, depending on where you are. This is Fantasy Grounds College. I am founder Layroon, and I want to discuss some things that have to do with the map tools. So the map tools is a fairly new innovation for Fantasy Grounds Unity. It's taken a while to get this thing coming out to be available for the public. This is not going to cover dynamic lighting as it's not released yet. But I will talk about some things that are released, and this will help you along your way. So when you are first opening up Fantasy Grounds and you want to use a map, you have a couple options. So you could import your own maps, or you can use maps that are provided within Fantasy Grounds. With maps being imported into your game or into your campaign session, it'll be a little bit easier for you to manipulate those, and you have a little bit more control over it. However, if you have a map that's contained in a module, you can still customize it, you can paint on top of it, but you will not be able to include it in a campaign to be exported. You will have to have the module loaded. A lot of people wonder why they cannot use Fantasy Grounds to create a map and then export it. The main reason is, first, copyright. The other issue is Fantasy Grounds was not engineered to export that type of data. The other thing is that when you buy a map pack or the assets pack that you can get on the stores, the idea is that you're going to use Fantasy Grounds within Fantasy Grounds. So in other words, you're not buying this to be a Photoshop engineer. You are basically creating your own maps within Fantasy Grounds. The nice thing about this is that if you do use the assets that are in Fantasy Grounds, like the tiles, the paintbrushes, all the little doodads and widgets, it cuts down on the memory that's required to send from the host or the game master over to the player. The only thing you're going to be sending, technically, are the asset coordinates or the asset file names. So if your players have the same assets and the same files, you will be able to send your map as a module to your friends. If they load the module and they have the same map packs or the same assets, it will load for them. If not, you'll get a bunch of little red X's and such. So there is a way to make maps and share them with your friends, and I'm pretty sure on the Fantasy Grounds forums, there is a place where you can find such a thing. I would look in the armory first and see if anyone shared their maps. But this also would mean that you have to have the map packs installed. So if you don't have any of the map packs, or if you don't have a license, it will be difficult for you to see or use those. So generally, when you go to your assets folder, it's on the bottom right corner. When you open that up, you will have 3 tags up here on top. You have one for tokens, you have one for portraits, and you have one for images. Make sure that you remember where you're at when you're using Fantasy Grounds. I don't know how many times myself that I have made the mistake of going into tokens or putting the wrong type of files in this folder. So you want to make sure you know which folder you're in when you're accessing your assets. The next thing, assuming that you have assets, as you can see, I have a number of folders. These come from different modules that I own, and even though I don't have them loaded, I still have access to the photos or to the assets. If I load them, it's easier for me to manipulate and add them to a campaign. If you have your own products, if you add them to the folder, which is in this folder button, when you click on that, it opens up a folder in the back end, and it will usually steer you to the campaign setting that you're in at the moment. If you want something to be available at all campaign levels, then you need to put it in the data folder. If you only want the assets and the maps and the tokens and such and portraits in your specific campaign or session, then they will go in the campaign folder. When you first come to this folder, and if you don't have any custom content, the campaign folder will not be there. You have to go to the folder icon, put some images in there, and then this little button down here, refresh folder assets, once you click that, it will update Fantasy Grounds assets, and then you will see the campaign folder. Once you see the folder, you double click on it, and any files that you've put in there, including your maps, your handouts, were in the images section, it will show. So I manually added this icon. So this icon is the same one I have loaded on the screen. So with that, you can do a couple things. Double click on this, and when I say this, I'm talking about the image itself, and you get a preview window. Now for this preview, you will get two options. You can create an image record, which adds this image to your images section on the right-hand side. And it'll go into something called all or uncategorized. If you want it to go into a specific folder, you need to create the folder. So if I want this to go into a custom group, I just added a folder by clicking on Add Category, and it made a group called Group 1. Now all I have to do is click on the Edit button or Edit Groups. I will edit it to say FGC logos. I will get out of the edit mode, and then I will select it. Now I am in a custom group that I've made for my campaign. The reason I do this is for organizational purposes and also so I can find the content. If you just stick it in anywhere, it makes it a little harder to locate. So now when I click on Create Image Record, it's going to go into this folder, and as you can see, it pops up as a separate image. So that is one way that you add content to Fantasy Grounds if it's custom content. Now let's say you have several images and they are in the same folder as this Fantasy Grounds College. So if you have several items or maps or handouts, you can click on Create from Campaign Assets. But that assumes that you have all of your images organized and put into the campaign folder and that you've refreshed. Once you've done that, and they'll show up in here, then you can double click on them and you can add them individually, or in the images and maps area, you can click on Create from Campaign Assets, and that will import all of them. If you do it twice, it'll give you a little warning. It'll say you already have this image. No big deal. It'll show up down here in the chat window. But ideally, you want to get all of your images organized, resized, file names fixed, all that stuff before you import them. If you don't have that luxury, fine, whatever, but just let you know that it's more ideal to have it organized. The other thing is import files. So this would be used if you have random files throughout your computer and they're not organized, then you can import them one at a time. So this gives you kind of a browser window search thing where you can go and pull in assets from all over your hard drive. So those are your shortcuts. Now you can just individually add them as you go, or you can use the mass import depending on your situation. The other thing that can be done at this point is that you can assign this image to the background. So if I hit Set Background Decal, it will set it for you, and it will be the size that it is. So in other words, if you want this larger, you're going to need to resize that before you import it. The next thing is if you want to get rid of this, or if you want to swap it out, you can repeat that process, or if you're not going to have a decal at all, you can go into the options menu up here on the right, and you come down to where it says decal. Right now it's set at custom because I chose to import it. So I will turn it off, or you can go back to the SmiteWorks logo, or maybe you have one of the art extensions that come from the official content. If that's the case, then you can use those. Or I went back to the custom image, which was the last image I imported. So you can't have more than one custom image loaded as a preset. You have to have one or none. So there's no custom 1, 2, 3, 4. So if you want to do that, you have to go back in your assets and re-import the image. So this is a way that you can allow for you to customize your background. One thing I recommend is if you have a square image, it looks really nice if you can kind of fade out the edges. That way, when you put it in Fantasy Grounds, it kind of blends in instead of having a line. So instead of having this really stark defined line on the outside, if you feather that out in a program like Photoshop, it'll blend in with the background a little bit better. But that's just a tip. So this is just a logo for Fantasy Grounds College. So I'm using this as just an example. So this is what you kind of would like to do if you would, want to customize your campaign and you want something to show up in the background. And maybe you'll switch this out once per week or once per session, whatever you want to do with it. So that is basically the startup of getting your content. So I'm going to go over that once again. So you go into Assets. Make sure you're in the correct folder or preview. So you have Tokens, you have Portraits, and you have Images. Make sure that you're in the Images folder. And if you want to add a map that is something custom to you or to the campaign, you will open up the folder button on the bottom. It will open up the campaign folder, and you will copy and paste your data into that folder. And once you do that, you click on the Refresh Folder Assets button, which is right next to the folder button, and your campaign folder or bag will appear. It won't be there by default on a fresh, brand new campaign, unless you've added all that beforehand. But you still need to refresh whenever you make changes. So your campaign folder is exclusive to one game. If you put your content in a data folder, you can access it from any game. So there's two levels. You have the master data level, and then you have the campaign level. So for instance, in my campaign, I only have this Fantasy Grounds logo, or Fantasy Grounds College logo. In the data folder, I have a few folders that I created myself. I have one called Arctic Snow, Oceanic Maps, Spell Tokens, and then I have one dedicated to the cartographer, Tom Kartos. So in the Arctic Snow, I have assets, I have cold and snow random maps, and I have some handouts. So these are for a Reign of the Frost Maiden campaign, or for any setting that requires snow or ice. Or even if you're in the mountains, maybe you have to go over a mountain pass and you need these assets. So in the assets folder, I have a bunch of different bags that are various things. So I have vectors of bookshelves and things I can use to build a map or place on top of an existing map or make tiles out of. I also have, in the Arctic Snow area, I have the cold and random maps. So these are maps that I've collected from the DM's Guild or that other authors or cartographers have made and they put out there. So I'm a patron of a lot of different cartographers. So I get new maps every month. I'm looking at like Chris McDermott. I'm looking at Zovia. I'm looking at people like that create content. So that is something that you'll have to do manually when you download or grab content online. One of the biggest mistakes I think that most new people do, including myself, is first, they don't understand the dimension call out for Fantasy Grounds. So in other words, there should be a maximum that you have to keep in mind. So the maximum for most maps is 2048 by 2048. And that's a big map. That'll cover my entire screen. You don't really necessarily want a map that big because when you add it to Fantasy Grounds, it's going to take a lot of memory. It's going to be hard to push that content to your players, and it's going to be very cumbersome to use. So if you use a big, huge map, it's going to be difficult to scroll in and out, back and forth. So if you've used something like Dungeon of the Mad Mage, you'll know what I'm talking about. It is very difficult to use maps that are big, and that's just plain physics. The other thing is that most battle maps are only roughly between 1200 to 1800 dimension-wise, and they don't need to be that huge. especially if it's a situational map and you're not having a big mass battle. You don't need a huge map. You need a map that has like maybe 4 rooms or less, and you don't need a huge map. So for instance, I have this random cold and snow map here. Let's see what this looks like. So if I double click that, here's the preview. This is a huge map. I don't think I would use this, and if I did, I would put it in a program and I would probably take I'd break it up into pieces, in other words. So I would probably just use this piece of it and then maybe this section here, this section. So that way, when I load this, it's not too big and the file size is not too crazy. That is something you need to keep in mind when you're using Fantasy Grounds in general. You don't need huge whopping files. Fantasy Grounds Unity can handle bigger file sizes. However, on the network side of things, that may not be true. So if you have a player that's using a wireless connection, they're going to have issues. Sometimes when you actually share an image like this, it takes it a long time to cache on a player's computer. Sometimes they have to reboot. Whatever the issue is, it's usually because the file size or the dimensions or a combination of both are too big. So think smaller when you're using maps with Fantasy Grounds if you can help it. Sometimes you don't have a choice, such as the Dungeon of the Mad Mage. That's the way it was put out. However, if you are going to spend the time to learn how to use the map tools, you will start to realize that it's simpler to have a 1 or 2 room map and not a bunch of huge maps that are hard to work with. So I would honestly take this map and break it up in about 4 or 5 pieces. Now, that's not something you can do with maps that come with modules. So if you are running a official module, unless you buy the maps outside of Fantasy Grounds and import them yourselves, the ones that are included with a topic or with an official product, then you are going to have no ability to modify that other than adding tokens or assets or effects. But you will not be able to cut and paste and tear it up. So you have to do that on your own outside of Fantasy Grounds. So the assets that you bring in, you have more flexibility with. The ones that come with Fantasy Grounds, you pretty much have to use them in Fantasy Grounds. And there is no way to export a map. So if I make a bunch of changes on this map here, and I want to send that to my players, I'd have to send them this image with the same file name, the same folder, and all the same assets in order for this to load properly. So when you make a module in Fantasy Grounds, especially with the assets that are built into Fantasy Grounds or the ones you get from a subscription, those will be the coordinates that you're getting. You're not getting the actual files. You're just going to get the coordinates, the location, and the file names. You're not going to get the actual physical file. So that's something that most people don't understand is you have stuff that's built into Fantasy Grounds or into the official content, or you might have someone that puts out map packs. Those you cannot manipulate as easy as assets that you bring in. The main thing is that they want you to try to use the Fantasy Grounds assets as opposed to bringing in big, huge files like this. So when you use a Fantasy Grounds asset, it's taking up less memory, usually, and it doesn't cost you as much to send it to your players. So instead of sending this entire map to your players, you're only going to be sending the little coordinates and the color and the tiles and maybe those file names. You're not actually sending the content. So that's something that you need to keep in mind as a game master. And if you have problems where maps are not showing up, maybe you have one person that's having issues, more than likely it's a bandwidth issue or something's going on with their antivirus or whatever. It's usually not Fantasy Grounds. It's usually a misunderstanding of how it works. And how this works is if this map is sent over to a bunch of my players, there's probably going to be 1 or 2 of them are going to have problems with it. And that's because of their computer, their network, and the amount of bandwidth that's available. So bandwidth is basically if you don't have roughly about 10 megabytes per second up, so your upload speed matters a lot. It's going to be difficult for your players to receive any of your content, especially if you're sending these big whopping files. If you're just sending some maps that you made within Fantasy Grounds with the existing tiles and the existing art packs, the only thing you're really sending is the data that tells the other players where and how to be assembled. It doesn't send the actual file unless you make this yourself as a big, huge PNG file and you send that over. That's where the bandwidth problem comes in. That was an issue with Classic. So we weren't able to differentiate between having data sent over or actually having the file. So that's something that a lot of people don't understand. I'm trying to make that clear so that when you actually use maps in Fantasy Grounds, it's not going to be such a burden on you, your players, and especially your network. So try not to be on a laptop or some sort of mobile device if you're going to be the host, especially if you're going to be sending large files like this. You do not want to be connected that way. It creates a lot of potential for disconnecting, and it also is very hard on the network. So even if you have a good internet connection, it's not going to matter if your players don't. So just keep that in mind, that the smaller the file sizes, the better. So let's move on to some more things that may be helpful to you. So right now, I kind of have this theme for the Ream of the Frost Maiden. Coming up in a couple weeks, we'll probably be switching over to the new Van Richten's Guide to Barovia, which will be out in a couple weeks. But for now, we're still in the aftermath of the Ream of the Frost Maiden, which is the last setting that was put out. So I'm going to go into my assets folder. And right now, I don't really have a whole lot that I want to dig into with the assets without wading through file after file. So I've loaded a map pack, which is in the library. So if I go to the library, I just have the SRD loaded. And these are modules that were made in the map packs. So there's this Cutmere Shard, which is a Chris Game Tile Warehouse product. And then there's the Shard Roads. So one's more wilderness-like, and then one is a lot more, roads and such. So I'm going to use this Cutmere Shard Meanders pack. And if you click on Images and Maps, there is a plethora of maps that are themed. And then he has this little shortcut thumbnails of all the maps that are included in the pack, which is really handy. Now, this was an older way to deal with Classic, but it still is valid to this day using Unity. So if I go to Images, and if you have that module loaded, you'll see the actual panels here, and these will be actually in the campaign if you have the actual modules loaded. So if I open up this map pack here, and this is assuming that you have official content. It's kind of the same thing. That's why I'm showing this to you. So if I unlock this, I'm going to be able to manipulate it if I want. In some cases, they don't allow you to unlock it. I don't know why they would do that, but that's just how they made it. In this case, I don't want to modify anything on here because it's just basically a shortcut to the thumbnails. So I'm going to use one of the ice bridges to illustrate some of the things that can be done with the map tools. So if I double click on one of these red pins, and again, these are only available for the Game Master, then I can actually access one of the files that's part of the module. And now that I have it, I'm going to open this up. And this would be done before a game or before a session or, when I'm checking stuff out. Now on the top right corner, if it's not a proprietary image or it doesn't belong to somebody, it shouldn't be locked. So if you can unlock it, you're in good shape. And now it's kind of off-centered a little. So you have this little drop-down toggle toolbar in which you can click on Zoom to Fit. Or if you want to, conversely, you can right-click on any image, go to View, and you can click Zoom to Fit or Zoom to Fill. Zoom to fill will cover the whole thing. Zoom to fit will fit within the parameters of the window. So I usually do zoom to fit. If it's not enough room for you, you can stretch it out a little bit more. If it looks too far away, or if you're having trouble seeing it, you can always zoom in. You're zooming in with the mouse button. So if you click somewhere on the map and you use your mouse wheel, you can roll in and out. So that's some of the controls that you need to learn when using maps. So that doesn't even touch the line of sight. This is more just basics on manipulating and using Fantasy Grounds. Now, when you're actually playing with this map, it might look a lot smaller, and I'll show you that shortly. So I choose maps generally that do not have the grid on them. There's a couple of reasons. One is I want to have more control over the actual dimensions, or the, how would I say, scale of the map. If you know the scale, if you buy a legitimate map, usually the author will publish how many pixels per square. So in this case, most of the maps that Chris puts out are between 50 and 60, maybe up to 75, depending on the size of the map that you put in here. You want to keep the small or medium-sized maps as far as file size. Medium to me means like 10 megabytes or less. In Classic, they basically said use 2 or less or 1 or less for megabytes. So you have a little bit more flexibility on the map file size, but just remember, the more you push to your players, the more bandwidth it takes. So one file like this might be 10, 15 megabytes. If I send that to my players, that's multiplied by the time of the players that are connected to me, so that you're going to have this multiplied by that number as you're pushing it out through your network. Your game is hosted on your computer, not on the cloud. The only thing that's hosted on the cloud is your password information and your connection. Nothing else is hosted. No files, no nothing. It's just your name, your account, your IP address, and the handshaking process. Everything else is hosted on your computer. So let's get that clear as well. So a lot of people don't understand that that is basically one of the things that Fantasy Grounds offers, is a cloudless connection, but the handshaking process, the actual connection itself, is in the cloud. So you're not actually hosting the game on the cloud. You're only hosting the connection. So this map is basically designed in GIMP. Chris spends a lot of time building these rocks and the assets for it. So the first thing you want to do with a map like this, if you don't already have a grid, or even if you do, is to put a grid on it. So on the top right, place a grid. You can turn on the visibility with a little eye icon, and that puts this on the map. So it looks like 50 looks good for this scale of map. You could probably go up to 60, so let's see what that looks like. And I have them linked together, so the sizes are, it's going to scale both ways evenly, so they're linked. So yeah, that's probably about as wide as you'd want to go, is 60. And if you notice, the grid is kind of thick and obnoxious and gray. So if you don't like the color or how much it stands out, click on the color picker wheel, and then you can assign any color you want. So I can have a themed color, or you can take the little eyedropper and hover over anything on your map that gives you color. And that will theme the map to the colors of the map. So if I click on that, it themes it to the colors that are available in this given photo. Or you can take the color from anywhere. Then you want to scale down a little bit your transparency so that it's not so thick and bright and it's not so obnoxious. And then you click OK. And you have a grid on here, but it's very light. It's not obnoxious. And it's themed for the color. So it kind of blends in with the map more. Now, in some cases, you want it brighter so you can see that detail a lot more. In this case, I chose to make it more blended in because the lines sometimes take away from the immersion. So right now, it's kind of this greenish, kind of a blue color. So it's taken from one of these images. So if you wanted to change it, if this is too light, I can go back to the color picker and I'll hover over one of these river tiles. Maybe you want something darker, but then you can also turn down the transparency, hit OK, and that gives you a little bit more visibility, but it's themed for the color of the map. So that's the first step, is to put the grid on there. Now, if you already have a grid painted, if you buy a reputable map, it's more than likely going to be square, and it should line up. If you snag something off the internet or you resize a photo and you try to put it in Fantasy Grounds, you will find that it's been stretched and it's oblong. So these won't actually be squares. They're actually probably rectangles. And that's going to be a real pain to try to line up the lines. So there is a tool out there called Map-Align. It's free. It's on the Fantasy Grounds forums. I will put it in the description later after this video. But that tool allows you to gradually stretch the file out so that it will line up, and then you have to re-export it, put it in Fantasy Grounds, then put the grid back on it. So it's easier if you buy a map or find one without a grid, or you learn to use the Map-Align tool. So it just depends on what you have. So when you take a photo and you resize it, you have to do it mathematically, and you have to know the dimensions or the pixels per inch, and also the dimensions of the map. Sometimes you have to use half or percentages of a whole number. So it might be 60.5 or 60.125 or whatever. So if you're really trying to get something to line up, try fractions as well, not just whole numbers. Get as close as you can with the whole number and then play around with the incremental fractions. So that is just basically a primer on putting a grid on a map. Now this grid will not carry over to another campaign. So if I use this image again, I have to resize it in a different campaign. So this grid only stays with this particular campaign. It's not universal. It doesn't write to any files. It's just basically a way for you to foreign off sections of the map so that when you put a token on it, it scales properly and you can keep track of distance. It doesn't write to the file itself. It's just an overlay, basically. So the next step is to consider, what are you going to use the map for? Is it just going to be role play? Because if that's the case, you don't really need to do too much more with it. If you want just a little bit more immersion, but maybe you want like a little snow or something, you can add that. But just remember that the more effects that you add, the more memory it's going to take. And it also can cause to where your computer is going to start giving you problems because you're running too much stuff in the background. So for instance, this map here has a grid on it, and I want to add some snow. Okay, I don't really need to do line of sight or anything necessarily, but I'm going to do some snow background. So if you click on the very bottom of the Map Tools window, there's an effects layer that you can add. And that's just a layer, it's blank right now. And then I'm going to click on Effects, which gives you the menu to what you want to choose from. Now, when you're working in Fantasy Grounds, make sure you are clicked on the correct item that you're trying to manipulate. Quite often, it will move on you, and I don't know what does that. But when you're clicked here and you're trying to do this, it's not going to work. You need to be on the item that you're trying to edit or use. That is something that you need to learn to look for when you're using Fantasy Grounds. Once in a while, it will move on you. It'll drive you nuts. So just make a quick check before you do anything to make sure you're on the correct layer. The next thing is the drop-down menu of snow. So I'm going to click on snow. And as you can see, there's a snow effect. Now, if you notice, it's all over this map. I don't want it all over. I actually want this only to show in the map itself. So while you're in this layer, the snow layer, you can add a mask which covers everything up temporarily or until you're ready to draw. And the map, the snow is still happening, but it's actually behind the mask. Now you have tools which will hide or reveal areas. So I'm going to click on the reveal, and then I'm going to draw the dimensions, the outer dimensions of this map. And now the snow is contained within the map instead of all over the place. So you still have a huge mask here running, So keep that in mind, but the display area is confined to where you defined it. Now I'm going to zoom in and take a look at it, and it looks a little hokey. I don't really like the way it looks, so I'm going to turn down the amount of snow, turn up the intensity a little bit, and then that kind of gives a little more definition to it. And then the size of the snow itself, I'm going to turn that way down, because they don't need to be huge flakes. And then the speed can be adjusted accordingly. So if it's snowing really hard or not snowing hardly at all. So I'm going to put it down to about maybe like here. It's a slow snowfall, not a lot of wind. And then you have an intensity thing, that multiplier. So if you really want to see the snow, you can turn it up. But I think that's a little overkill. And then I'll turn down the amount. So that's a pretty fair amount of snow without being too ridiculous. And then, like I said, I turned the speed down so you can see the flakes a little bit better. I turned the flake size way down because it was way too big. And then the intensity is up to you. Like, do you really want to show the snow, or do you want it to be kind of subtle? And then the amount is a multiplier. So it actually will show more or less. It basically just fades it in and out. So that's basically what you're getting there. If you want it to be less contrast, or do you want it to actually blend in with the map? So it's kind of an alpha tool there. So anyways, that's basically how you would add an effect. So that's one effect that you can add to this. And when you're working on the map, if you don't want that to happen the whole time, or if you want to stop it snowing, let's say that snow stops, you have a toggle switch here which says visible to all, or it's only visible to you, or you can turn it off altogether. So you can do this while you're working on the map, and then later you turn it on when you need it. That's something you have to get used to when you're using Fantasy Grounds. Now, it isn't always conducive to do this in the middle of a game. However, you can set this up beforehand and have it do what you want, functionality. So it depends on the situation and how you're using the maps. What if I want snow, rain, and mist? You can add those. They're separate layers. So I will add another layer. But before I add more than one effect, I'm going to make a folder. So add a folder. And double click on it, and I'm going to rename this my effects folder. And the reason I'm doing this is because then you can turn them all on or off at once. So now I'm going to drag the snow layer into the effects folder. Now my next effect is going to be mist. So again, I'm going to add another layer, an effects layer, which is blank. I'm going to use the drop down, and then I'm going to use mist. And then I'll make my adjustments accordingly. So mist would imply that this would not be clouds, but lower to the ground. So with the mist layer, I'm more than likely going to put it underneath the snow layer. So I'll put it in this folder, and you notice the location of the mist is going to be under the snow. So when it's snowing out, the mist won't be riding on top of it as much, and it will make more sense because you want the mist to just be in certain areas. So now I'm going to take the mist itself, I'm going to turn down the amount a little bit, and the speed is either left or right for direction, so you can center it closer to 50 and the actual mist will move accordingly. So I have it kind of on a slower rate. I'll turn the amount up a little bit so we can see the mist. And then I'm going to add a mask again. That way it's not everywhere. And now I'm only going to have the mist. You know, you can define where you want it to come out, but I'll just make it for the whole map. So I'm going to draw. I'm in the reveal tool, and I'm going to draw out what exactly I'm going to use this for. So this is the area that it's confined to, and I'm going to turn the mist down so that it is not so crazy. There we go. So we have mist. It's underneath the snow layer, so it doesn't cover the snow, and it's very subtle, but it's there. I can actually turn up just a hair. There we go. So now when you're playing, that mist will play its part in the game. So that's one thing that you could do in your game session. So the next thing is, let's take a look at this water. Now this is frozen icy water. So there's not a lot we can do with it. However, I'm going to temporarily turn off the effects. So when you lock this into place and you change the visibility, you can actually turn them all off at once instead of one at a time. Or you can expand the folder and do it manually. But it makes it a lot simpler when you're working with maps to have them in an effects group. So now what I'm doing is taking this and I'm going to consider adding a water effect, and it's going to make it real subtle because this is frozen water. So what I'm going to do is, again, I'm going to add another layer, and this time this is going to be water effect. And as you can see, the whole map distorts, which is something you probably don't want unless it's an ocean. So I'm going to go ahead and add a mask, and then I'm going to add reveal area, which is what I'm going to do. And instead of revealing on the whole map, I'm only going to reveal in this contour of the water. Now, you don't have to draw the entire water in one swoop. So if you want to draw freehand without doing squares, you hold the Alt key down, and you're going to trace roughly this contour around the edge of this particular area. So I'm not going to go right up to the edge. I'm just going to draw around the contour. And now you can see that the water effect has been applied. I'm going to do the same thing down here. You hold the Alt key and you left click and drag your mouse to draw the area. You can draw it in little patches. So if you need more detail, you can zoom in. So I'm going to hold down the Alt key and trace and draw this around. And I'm not going right up to the edge. I'm leaving a little bit of room. And if you notice, I didn't draw over the snow. And I kind of left that because that's part of the contour. And the cliffs, I'm just kind of getting kind of close to them, but not too close. Because I figure that part's going to... I'm not getting too close to the edge because I'm figuring that part is going to be free from movement. Now, as you can see from a distance, I mean, yeah, it shows water, but it looks a little ridiculous. So I'm going to turn that down. So I'm going to take the horizontal and turn that down a little bit. I'm going to take the intensity down to almost nothing, maybe 2. And then the speed way down so it's not ridiculous. And then the droplet size is going to go way down to like maybe 5. So now when you look at it, when you're zoomed in, you can see the movement, but it's not too ridiculous. The next thing I'm going to do is move this into the effects folder. And now the effects folder has all these effects, and the water just happens to be where I want it. I want it underneath the snow and the mist because that's at the very bottom layer. So now I can minimize that or maximize it, and then I can turn on all the effects at once. That's why I put them in the folder just in case. So when you're working with maps, it's nice to have that on-off switch for everything. Now, if you find performance issues or you're getting a lot of lag, it's more than likely because you have too much of this going on at once, depending on your computer and such. So that's why it's nice to be able to turn that off, and you can remove layers if you need to. Hopefully you won't run into that, but that can happen. So at the most, I don't think I would run more than 3 of these filters or for these effects. Once you get more beyond that, it starts getting very laggy. It can cause problems. So just remember that. So I'm going to temporarily close this off because I don't want to see those effects right now. I'm going to move into doing a little bit of line of sight, that sort of thing, so that you guys can get an idea of the process. So I've already got the idea of my effects. There's not too many things I need to put line of sight on, but I will put terrain in here. And this rock here will have terrain. This rock up here will be terrain. And this ledge, all the ledges basically will have a little bit of terrain. And that's so you can't see up above. And that's mainly the reason for it. So to add terrain, you first, or any sort of line of sight, you need to be in this little brick icon here, which is the line of sight tool. Then going to take the terrain itself and click on this little tree here, which is the terrain tool. Now, I'm not going to be perfect. I'm just going to sketch around the edge of this cliff because that's the part that I don't want them to see right away. And there's actually a trail on this side, and then there's like a little bit of a landslide on this side. So you just kind of play around with what looks best to you, but I'm going to go ahead and trace that. So I'm going to go to the line tool, zoom in a little bit, and all I'm doing is just kind of tracing around here. You don't need as many points as I'm putting on here. As a matter of fact, I've been told that if you put too many points on your maps, the data points are going to recalculate every second. And if that's the case, you're going to run into problems. So that means you're going to have too much going on. It's going to cause Fantasy Grounds performance to go way down. So when you're making these lines, you don't have to be as perfect as I'm doing right now. You can actually be a lot looser. It doesn't have to be perfect. So this area will now be a terrain piece. So when it's on, that means when the players are down below here, they can't see this area unless they walk up the trail. So I have one little part here that I'm going to add terrain to. And I'm going to go to the other side and do the same thing. I'm using my arrow keys to navigate, and I'm zooming in and out. So if you're in this tool, you can use your arrow keys to move the map around. So again, I'm just going to grab this little area. I'm just going to worry about this area. I'm not going to try to do the whole thing in one fell swoop. It's going to be too hard to do that. So to start up here, I hit the escape key, or you can double click to get out of the drawing mode. Now I'm down here again. I'm going to do the same thing. Notice that I'm not really trying to get every little nook and cranny. That is not the idea for this. That is a mistake that a lot of us made in the beginning. You do not need 50,000 data points. On curved edges, you don't have a lot of choice, but in a straight line, definitely don't need that. And if you want to go in after the fact and adjust some of these, you go back to select mode. You need to get used to going back and forth between the different modes. When you're in line mode, you're going to be drawing. You don't want to manipulate or move things around. When you are in select mode, that is where you grab a link or one of these nodes, and you can move them as you need. Sometimes when you have a vertice where they come together, you don't have that option. But any of these ones in the middles, you can adjust those. So if you want to adjust this one, you can come in here and make your adjustments. So draw the main contour and then come back and make your adjustments. So you're not adding more points. You're just manipulating where the points line up. So it's important that you know how to do this. This is something that takes your map skills to the next level. Once you get used to how the tool works and its limitations and such, this gets a lot easier. So just practice. Don't complain that it doesn't work, because it's usually user error anyways. So that's usually what I get into, is I'll start whining and complaining. And then I stop doing that eventually, and I go, okay, I need to figure this out. So that's what it takes. You need to learn to use the tool. It's like riding a bike. Once you learn it, it's kind of hard to unlearn it. However, in the state that Fantasy Grounds is in now, you will have changes. So some of this stuff that I'm covering now might change. So I apologize if you're watching this in the future. A year from now, some of this stuff may not even be applicable. Fantasy Grounds is in a state of change, but for the best practices so far, this is what I have. And for those of you in the future, this is May 3rd, 2021. So anytime after this, there could be big changes. We don't have the ambient lighting yet, so we're not covering that. And that'll be something that we'll do separately. So now that you have those, now I'm going to draw a pit where the water is. And the reason for that, if someone slides down in there, they're not going to be able to see the outside very much. So I'm going to make a pit. So there's a pit tool here. And again, I'm going to go to the line tool. Make sure you're in the right tool for what you're doing. So again, I hit the escape button, or you can double click on your last dot, and that gets you out of the tool. So you're not drawing over it. And then if you want to adjust anything, you can go to the selection tool. And from the selection tool, this is where you drag the lines so that you can make your adjustments accordingly. So if I need to do that, just go like that. So all I did was adjust a few of these lines. I'm doing that to show you I'm not too worried about them, to be honest. They're not that important. The only thing they do is they serve as a way to keep light out. So if someone falls into this water, they can't see. At least they can't see outside of the pit. So I'm going to add the pit down here in this little section of water. See, I started to click already and I wasn't in the correct area. You need to be in the line tool to make lines. The select tool is where you move things and adjust. Okay, so there's the pit tool. Now, if you notice down here, I don't need these two extra lines, these two extra nodes. So I'm going to go into the selection tool. I'm going to stretch this out. I don't want these two extra lines. They're unnecessary. Okay, this is one line. You don't need the extra lines unless there's something there. So to get rid of them, you single click and you click on the minus, and that removes the point. And you notice when you highlight it, it shows up here to be removed. So there's your removal process. So learn how to manipulate points, or if you need a whole series of points to remove, you double click, or you can highlight this area and hit delete and it will get rid of multiple points. So this is basically your line of sight. And in order to check line of sight, you have to be in play mode and you have to turn on line of sight. I think a lot of people forget that. You have to be able to turn this on or off when you're using it and when you're not using it. If you're not using it, you're usually setting up your map and your encounters. Once they're in place, then you enable it right before you get ready to play. In this case, I'm going to grab an NPC and put it on the combat tracker. That's the first step to testing. So I'm going to click on the combat tracker. I'm just going to add an NPC. I don't even really mind what it is. See, that's an aboleth. There we go, Acolyte. All right, so once you have possession of this, once it's on the combat tracker, it can be linked to the map. So I'm going to turn on the visibility, and I'm going to drag and drop this token on the map. Now, right now, line of sight is not enabled. So if I turn on line of sight, it's going to look dark and shadowy. But when you take possession of a character or a token, it will show your line of sight. And in this case, it's just these cliff tops that are not showing. So everything else is visible. Now, if she falls into the water, she cannot see up and around the cliff. And that's why I put the pit in there. As the game master, I can move the token out. But as a player, unless someone helps them, they're going to be stuck in there. So as the game master, you might have to intervene to pull the token out if it makes sense for your game. Now this layer here, do not delete this. This is your line of sight layer. So I would name it. I wouldn't even mess with it too much. So you know that this layer, and then you can lock it. So you know that this layer is all of your line of sight. So in line of sight mode, you're not getting a whole lot of that because it's not really dark and we don't have the vision tools yet. So until that happens, this is what we have. Now you could technically put some kind of terrain on here, depending on how tall this wall is. So maybe this is 3.5 feet. So if that's the case, you might want to put a little bit of terrain on here. But if it's a short 2-foot wall, I wouldn't even bother. That means that whoever's walking across can look over. That's all that means. But they won't be able to see the top of this rail. So if this wall was, greater than 5 feet, you could probably change that to where they can't see over the wall. But I don't think this wall was meant to be that tall, especially when this bridge was probably made by dwarves. So unlikely that it's going to be taller than 3. So that's basically a real basic breakdown of how to use the line of sight tool. Learn to toggle between the different tools. So when you're in line of sight tool, don't forget to go to selection mode, or when you're drawing in one of these shapes, or line mode. When you want to manipulate things and move them around, you can. So for instance, if I didn't want all these points in here, I could double click and I can either delete them or I can move the whole thing. So you can manipulate this in a lot of different ways. So if you have, maybe you have the same shape and you want to apply that over a given area. So if you make one, maybe you'll be able to get an idea of the shape of it and use it and create another duplicate layer and use that again. So you have a duplication layer, you have an add folder, you have effects, you have an add wall layer, and then you have a brush. So I'm not going to get too much into the brush, but if you have brushes available to you, I'd advise you to use some kind of, instead of just black here, use some sort of asset to paint with. So instead of this black line, you might have an asset in your folder. So if I'm going to look for snow, let's say. Dwarven Maid is the best. Hey, Shell, how you doing? So this is actually Shell's idea. She said map sessions are going to do the best. So I got 11 viewers, and I'll probably get a lot more on the back end. So yeah, good idea, Shell. So I'm actually kind of mirroring the class that I taught yesterday, and I figured that this would be a good way to kind of segue into using the tools if you haven't already. We've done a couple other videos, but they weren't as concise, and we were still kind of learning how to use the tool. So you see some of them older ones are pretty rough. So anyways, I have some snow assets. There's a data Arctic snow. There's some Arctic snow. Okay, so that's not exactly what I was looking for. But these are things that you could put into an Arctic situation. So I wouldn't draw with these tools. However, being that they're kind of themed for, an Arctic situation, maybe you want these bottles to sit up on the ledge. So instead of being in the paint mode, I'm going to go into layers mode, and I'm going to grab one of these assets and stamp it on the map. So let's go to the bottles. I grab those and put them in this little area here, which is the stamp tool. And I'm going to click on the stamp tile and just click on it. And as you can see, that's way too big. It's 6 by 2. So this tile itself is pretty big. So if I want to change that and shrink it down, I'm going to hold the Alt key or the Shift key. There we go. So I kind of re-stretched it out so it's not so distorted. And then you can rotate it as long as you're selected on the bottles themselves. But this is for when you place it. If you've already placed it, then you don't. This would be if you're going to place your next one. So this one's already placed. So I'm going to go to the selection tool. And I can move this around. And then I can manipulate it. Like so. Or you can flip it. I mean, it has a lot of variations in there. And then I'm going to make it a little bit smaller by holding the Shift key. And then what I'm going to do is go to the color picker. I'm not going to change the color so much, but I'm going to turn the transparency down just a hair so it kind of blends in with the map more. And then once you click away and you go into play mode, this is now a layer. Your players cannot mess with that. And it's just something that's sitting on the railing here. So it just gives you some more things to work with. So I need to find some brushes. So I'm going to go back to the data folder. And I want to just search from here, the master. So I'm searching for snow, which is probably a bad thing because there's too many assets with that title or name in it. So it just depends. Okay, so I know not to look at those Arctic snow ones because I know those are basically just a whole bunch of assets. There's some map tiles. I'm looking for brushes. All right, so here we go. Here's a hill or snow or whatever you want. So what I'm going to do is move this here. I'm going to go into brush mode. I don't think those would be good for brushing, but you could. So I'm going to go ahead and use this texture as my brush. So I'm going to go to, brush mode. I'm going to use this hill as my brush. And it's scaled at 1 by 1. So I might go half by half or quarter by quarter. All right, so it's going to be a third of the size that it normally is. So I can scale that too if I need to. So you can use this to kind of give you a little bit more so maybe you're just placing these where maybe that's rubble matter really. And now you can go to the color picker. You can change the hue if you want. And then you can change the transparency. So anytime you paint, you have control over this transparency. So I'm going to go ahead and erase some of this. And then the painting layer, if I go into the painting layer itself, and then I'm just going to go back into line mode, can make these, kind of like a line if you want, but then you can come to the color picker and you can turn down the opacity so that when you're painting, it's not so bright. So this might be part of a landslide. So for now on, when you paint, it's not going to be so dark. And these are things you can learn by watching Josh on Saturdays. He does this all weekend long, or all Saturday. So that's just an idea of what you can do with Paintbrush. You can put textures on things, you can make lines, whatever you want to do. So that's basically your functionality. You need to be in play mode to use the map tool as a map. So if you want to play, you need to have line of sight on, and you need to have play mode. When you're editing, you'll either be in layers, which you can drop in layers at this point during the game. So if you had to drop in a creature or something, or some kind of made asset like a tree or something, you can do that. The other thing is the paintbrush mode, which we were just in. Then the effects mode, which adds the effects. And then you have your line of sight. And then you have a mask, which is a universal mask. And that works just like your fog of war, like the old classic Fantasy Grounds. And there's a hut here, like a snow hut, that you could add if you wanted to. And then you have your grid layer. So just get used to those. And then when you're in one of the tools, make sure that you're in the correct mode. So for like line of sight, I'm in the line of sight tool. You can see all the line of sight. But when you go to play mode, you don't see that. And then if you turn off the line of sight, it's not going to work. So again, if you don't have possession of a token or a character, especially as a player, you're not going to see anything other than just some of the, it'll be black if it's not turned on correctly. So now when you move this character around, see, now I don't have possession of that character, so that's why it's doing that. When I do have possession of it, it shows up the line of sight. And like I said, if she falls off the cliff, she can't see anywhere but in the ice that she fell into. So this pit will not allow her to move out unless somebody comes to the edge and rescues her. And then as the game master, you'll move her up to the top. So that's just something you'll have to get used to. But nonetheless, it's some pretty cool stuff. So that's just a real generic, basic overview. Just get ready to use these tools and then be ready, especially in line of sight. Make sure you're in the selection tool when you want to select and move things. Make sure you're in the line tool when you want to go around contours. If you have a way to make an oval, or excuse me, a rectangle or a square, there's that tool. And if you need to create a circle, you can. So in this case, if you had a tree or something, or maybe let's put a solid circle around here, or maybe we just do the contour. But nonetheless, if you click on the ellipse and then you hold down the mouse and you go out beyond one square, it'll draw the ellipse. And then if you want to move this, you go back to the select tool, double click on the little dots, and you can move this wherever you want. So I'll just do it right there. So this is part of the pile that they can't get up and over. It's probably fairly tall. They have to squeak by over here. So now when I put on the line of sight and I go to the actual token, I've disabled. Now it's enabled. Oh, I made a pit out of this, so maybe it's an ice pit. But see, I used the wrong tool, so it's very easy to mistake those. So to fix that, I would go back to the line of sight mode, double click on one of these nodes, and then hit the delete key or this minus key over here. And then go back to the correct tool, which would be the wall tool, and then go back to the ellipse, draw my circle out. And see, I didn't go back to the selection mode. So you can hit Control Z if you make a mistake. And I'm going to go to the selection tool, double click so it grabs all the points, and move it just like that. So now when she comes up to this, I need to be in play mode, that she can't see over that pile. That's basically what's going on. I'd probably make this terrain because she can walk up on top of it, but I wanted to show you that you can make an occluder. So anyways, I think that should do it. I don't want to go on too much further, but this is just a real basic overview of how to use the map tools. Just remember, file size matters, and the amount of effects and lines and dots that you put on here make a difference. So don't use huge maps if you can help it, and don't put too many data points. Like if you're going to zoom in this close and click on every little bump here, that's not the way this is designed for. You can just put a line through it. It's not going to hurt anything. It doesn't have to be perfect. So that is great. This video is great. I have learned a lot of different ways to be more efficient. Yeah, no problem. Control Z gets you out of a mess sometimes, but you got to be careful because it might erase all of your work. Just a quick overview is when you're using the line of sight tool, make sure that you're in the right tool. So in the line of sight tool, use the selection tool to move things. When you want to draw, you're in these other lines or circles or squares. This line right here means that they're separate types of tools. So if you go to select, that is just a selection and manipulation tool. If you go to a drawing tool and you try to move something, it's going to draw a line. Don't do that. That's something that's very common when you first start. The other thing is putting things in folders. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn on the effects. So I had them turn off for now, the visibility. So now that I turn this on and I go to play mode, that's where you want to be. Now it looks like she's in the snow and she's trying to figure out why the snow fell down, and she's kind of stuck. She has to squeeze by this thing. And there's some little jars and such. Maybe she was creating a potion, or maybe she's eating a meal. Who knows? But that is basically how you use the tool in a very basic raw format. There are a bunch of techniques for painting and such. I don't have time to go into that. And when you're done with your work, make sure you lock your layers so that they don't get erased accidentally or moved. That's very helpful. And like I said, you can turn off things if you need to, or turn them on. It's good to have this subfolder, because then you can turn all the effects off at once instead of just one at a time, unless that's what you're trying to do. So you have visibility to everyone, visibility to your party, and then visibility to nobody. Once you're done, you lock the map, recenter it. You size the map to where you want to see it on your tabletop. So in this case, this is where I want the map to show up. I'm going to recenter it. There we go. So this player here, or this NPC, I have her sheet. I'll have it right here, and it's ready to go. So this is how I normally set up. And then down here, I'll put my story entry. Yeah, we're ready to go. So if she rolls initiative, let's see. Or I'll just have her roll a skill check. Yep, we're ready to go. So I rolled twice. She rolled a 7, and her next roll's a 20. What do you know? So anyhow, that's how you use the map tools. So take care. Goodbye, everyone. Happy gaming, and hopefully we'll see you around. Bye-bye. Oh, by the way, I'll be on Fantasy Grounds Fridays next Friday. So if you guys want